Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining me, Doc T, for another episode of the Horse Advocate podcast. I have given you an overview, and I've talked about cell metabolism a lot in the years that I've been doing this, but I wanted to boil down specifically into one aspect of feeding your horses. Now, before we go any further, you know that I am a veterinarian. I've been with horses 51 years and floating teeth for 41 years. Been a vet for 40 years. And there are a lot of nutritionists out there who don't believe that I should be talking about nutrition. And this is because most veterinarians have not received a lot of information or training in nutrition. But that's assuming that the veterinarian isn't interested. Well, I'm extremely interested because I've seen the demise of horses over my 50 plus years of being with them, of them falling apart. And come on, I mean, economically, forget the pain and suffering, just economically, you've invested so much money into your horse, trying to keep them sound, keep them healthy, and yet you're spending a lot of money on nutrition that's not doing that. And there's no other reason for it. And our hands are tied because we don't have hundreds of acres to turn our horses out in. We don't really exercise or work our horses by pulling our wagons into town every day to go to a local Starbucks because we get in our car and drive there. Heaven forbid we walk, right? So our horses are more sedentary, most of them. Some of them are used for exercise, for sport. And all of us think that these horses are working their tails off. And I get it. I sometimes exercise and think I'm working hard, but I'm not working as hard as a real athlete is working. And I'm certainly not working as hard as someone hundreds of years ago who had no means of getting from point A to point B except their own 2 feet, and had to till their gardens and go out hunting and sit in the cold. And so evolution has made life very easy for ourselves and for our horses. But the thrust of this podcast is to look at one element of nutrition that has been so misunderstood and misrepresented that it's time that I made it very, very clear to all of you who have horses that if you want your horse's health to improve, there's only one thing you need to do. Well, there's a couple things, but of all the things that you need to do, you have to stop feeding extra sugar. And you're thinking, but why? I love my donuts. I love my sugar in my coffee. I love a stack of pancakes. I love all sweet things. I've been told to eat my fruits and vegetables. And I've been taught to feed a horse a scoop of grain twice a day. I have a box full of sweet peppermints for him, and I feed him hay 24/7. And he's standing there looking happy, and he loves me. So why would I want to change anything? And I get that. And that's the journey you are on. Your journey is, I know it's not perfect what I'm doing, and I'm trying to figure out what is. And maybe this guy who's talking to me today is going to help me understand that a little bit more. But I know you're not scientists. You're not medically trained. Some of you have difficulty with chemistry, with math. You're better with poetry. And maybe I'll try to make this poetic. And I'll do that by taking a new expression that I am now living by, and I want you to live by, and understand that sugar is a molecule that fuels our brain and is required for us to live. There's no doubt about it. Sugar is very important. But the misunderstanding that we all have had, myself included, until I started to dig in and ask questions, is, do we have to eat glucose? Do we have to eat sugar to get sugar? And it turns out we don't. And that's what's really fascinating. Sugar is made inside every mammal that's out there. Let me repeat that. Every animal, every mammal on this planet can make all the sugar they need. And once you grab onto that one thought, and maybe I should put it into poetry, which I'm not very good at, but maybe one of you can send me it in poetry. The need for sugar is inside of you, made by you, for you, without any excess sugar having to go through what we affectionately call the pie hole, the hole that we put those sweet apple pies, cherry pies, lemon meringue pies, pumpkin pies, all loaded with sugar we stick in our mouth because they taste great. But we have to understand that the sugar that is sweet is called fructose. It is the sugar of fruit. The sugar that we use to fuel our body is called glucose. And glucose does not taste sweet. Just doesn't. But when you mix glucose and fructose together, you get a molecule made up of two smaller molecules, and that is called sucrose. And that's your white table sugar that you're putting in your coffee. And that 50% fructose has only one job in the body, and that is to add body fat. It does not create a lot of fuel. Worse, it sabotages the mitochondria in a way that prevents it from putting the brakes on. So picture the room that you're sitting in, whether it's your car or your barn or your kitchen, doesn't matter. Just put yourself inside a room. And in that room is a furnace that burns fuel. And when it burns, it creates energy. So just like gas going into the engine of your car, or in my case, the electrons going into the motor, that is converted into something that moves it down the road. And we don't know all the ins and outs of that. That's beyond our pay grade. I get it. But the same thing is happening inside the cell of your horse. Fuels are coming in and being converted in the furnace called the mitochondria. And most cells have many mitochondria. So you have a bunch of furnaces in there. And you can attach them. Well, they're floating inside the room. They're all around. Just look all around you. You can see all these little things called mitochondria. And they will be attached either to a bunch of fat, or they will start to pick up whatever glucose is in the body and burn those two fuels to make energy. So what's the problem with sugar? You need to look at the benefits and the damages of sugar. The benefits of sugar is it can be used as what we call a substrate or a fuel that will go through a complex process of 10 separate steps to blow off something called a phosphate group. And it's just phosphorus. Boom, it goes out there. And when that phosphorus group breaks off from an ATP molecule, T stands for tri. So there's 3 molecules of phosphate. When one blows off, there's a big spark of energy, and that energy is utilized in a very specific way to make the cell function. It's what keeps the lights on, if you will. So now we've got an ATP that's gone to ADP, and that molecule will run around and through a process, put that phosphate back up. So it goes ATP, ADP, ATP, ADP, ATP, ADP. And every time it goes from ATP to ADP, a molecule, or spark of energy flies. It's actually a hydrogen molecule, but don't worry about that. Boom, it goes. So that's what's supposed to happen. And the fuel that's used for that can either be glucose or a fatty acid. And a fatty acid, when it comes in, it goes from 3 to 2 to 3 to 2, but it uses only 4 steps to do that rather than 10 steps, 4 steps. And it also does not create free radicals, where the glucose works hard and blows off some pollutants called free radicals. More importantly is the amount of fuel that you have in your room. And if you're looking in your room, it doesn't matter what size room it is, there is a maximum amount of fuel that you can put in there, whether it's sugar or fat. There's just a maximum amount, and that is regulated by the number of furnaces or mitochondria that you have in the cell. So the mitochondria are saying, all right, I need fuel to operate. And so fat starts flowing in and sugar starts flowing in. And they both get to a point where they inhibit any more uptake of fat or sugar. So sugar comes knocking at the door. It's not coming in. That's called insulin resistance. And the sugar's turned away. In the meantime, fat comes in and fat's blocked from coming in because there's no more room. So it's saturated. It can be saturated completely with fat, completely with sugar, or a combination of both. But either way, the mitochondria are saying, hey, I can't take any more fuel. I'm pumping and working at my maximum rate for what is required for the cell. So if the cell is just sitting there doing nothing, the mitochondria don't have to work that hard. But if it's a muscle cell and you're competing and is working hard, it's going to need more fuel. But there's a maximum amount that it can take. And after that, no more. That's important because when fructose comes in, fructose destroys that maximum amount and causes more exhaustion of the mitochondria, which leads to reduction of energy, where you like run out of steam, where you become tired and you just don't want to work anymore. In addition, the fructose, which is the fructans of green grass in the spring, and the fructose of all fruit, is going to stimulate something called the Randle cycle. And this is something I just recently came across. Even though I've been talking about it, I didn't know that there was something called the Randle cycle. And what happens is when fat and sugar fill up the cell, the Randle cycle kicks in and will take the sugar and throw it into the liver and convert it into body fat. And that body fat is stored and you become fatter. The horse becomes fatter. You start to get the crusty neck, the fat pads on the body, and your vet comes by and says, your body condition score is 7 or 8 or 9, and you got to do something about this. And that's only because that horse is eating more sugar than he needs to power the cells. But what's interesting is when the cell fills up and the Randle cycle takes over, is basically shutting down the cell and not allowing fat or sugar to come in, the cell recognizes glucose as being a toxin for the organelles or the parts inside the cell. It will start to destroy the cell. And it does that by binding the glucose molecule to proteins inside the cell, which causes it to bog down, to slow down, and prevent the phosphate group from coming back on. So it goes from ADP back to ATP. So that process stalls. So now you have a bunch of ADP running around, and over here a bunch of phosphate independent molecules running around. And those get brought in to the fat and causes the release of cytokines, which are inflammatory cells. Those inflammatory cells cause inflammation. And inflammation in one cell, not a big deal. Inflammation in all the muscles, in the ligaments and tendons, in the fat stores leads to disease and breakdowns. Maybe possibly in the lamina of the hooves. But inflammation, we all understand, is being bad. We all have a little bit of inflammation. We're trying to reduce that by reducing stress, getting our sleep, reducing blue light coming into our eyes before bed, all these things, meditating, all these things. But for the horse, the number of stresses can be a lot. For instance, getting on a trailer, going to a horse show, competing, being around horses they don't know, breaking up their herd, not being allowed to turn out most of the day, but being confined to their stalls, having a groom they don't like. Their stress levels can be through the roof. And then on top of that, you're feeding excess sugar to these horses. And now all the sugar is entering the cell. So we have fat and sugar going into the cell, and they've reached the maximum amount the ATP can handle. The ATP is being slowed down, so it's not going from ADP back to ATP, so it starts to falter. And these free phosphate group molecules or phosphate elements are being used by the cells called cytokine. These are tissue necrosis factor or interleukin 6, or there's a bunch of them, and they can cause breakdown of tissue within the cell. So let's just put it this way. If you have in your room something that's bad, you're going to do whatever it takes to get rid of it, whether it's a bad smell or insects or a bad person, whatever it is, you're going to try and get that out of the cell. And the cell is going to do the same thing. And it does it two ways. One, it stores it in separate areas as glycogen. And that's there for a reason, because even though it's not as an efficient fuel, it's a very rapid fuel that can be used for emergency situations or that push at the end of your sport where it needs that much extra fuel. It's like a super fuel. Like a car with a supercharger, it just pumps in a little bit more fuel to get more energy out of the cell. And that's the purpose of storing glycogen. So the cell has the ability to pull glycogen out and burn that like a glucose molecule, like a sugar, and get that extra energy. But there's only so much storage for glycogen. So when you have excess sugar that's come into the cell, the first order of business is to clear out the bad guys. And that's why glucose is always used first. But because of the Randall cycle, the cell will not bring in any more fat and will not use fat. It becomes stuck. So as you feed your horse more grain and more sugar-laden hay, that sugar is going to come into the cell, and as it reaches its maximum, it's going to shut down, not let any more sugar in. So that sugar is going to go to the liver and be converted into body fat. But if the cell is asked to do something, so it's a horse that's being worked, it will burn the glucose up first and get rid of that before it will start to use the fat for fuel. Unfortunately, that period of time where the mitochondria says, okay, I'm done using glucose, let me use the fat now, is days. Not minutes, not seconds, not hours, but days. They're thinking about 72 hours. So you can't just switch back and forth. This is the idea behind fasting in humans. You stop the mitochondria from using glucose. Or if you start a diet yourself where you decrease glucose, or if in your horse, you eliminate all sugar that's coming in through the grains and you start soaking the hay, that sugar in the cell will decrease to a point where the mitochondria will start to use the fat. It may take 3 days to get there, but once it does, that fat is going to be consumed inside the cell, and now fat outside the cell is going to be released by the fat cells, and it's going to transport itself through the bloodstream and come into the muscle cell, and they'll start to use that as energy. And remember, it is a much more efficient fuel. And once you get that flow of fat coming from the body fat and from wherever else it is into the muscle cell, your horse is going to have all the energy it needs to do anything it wants, and it will not tap out the ATP. It will allow the ATP to continue to function to the end of that sport event. This is why horses on grain-free diets that have limited sugar intake into their bodies on a 3-day event course, when they do the cross country and they get to the end, they're ready to do it again. They're not exhausted. Same with endurance riders. They're finding that their horses are having more energy and recover faster because this efficiency of fat coming into the cell is so much better. So remember, the body is going to take glucose that it needs and use it in the brain and anywhere else that it needs to make a glucose molecule, including in the joints and other places. So glucose is necessary for life. But remember, the horse will make all the glucose it needs. It does not need glucose from any outside source. That's the part that's hard for us to wrap our heads around, because you, I don't care how old you are, have been eating apple pies and having dessert and love an ice cream cone because they taste good. But if you're going to have mom's apple pie or whatever treat, know that you can handle that once in a while. You can give your horse a carrot once the fat is coming through. But until the cells recognize that no more sugar is coming in, and it's now okay to take the flow of fat, the fat river, from the fat cell down the arteries, which is fine. It causes no problems. The body is built to transport fat through the blood vessels and deposit it into the cell, the muscle cell, where it'll be attached to mitochondria and used as a fuel source, a very powerful and efficient fuel source. Once you see that happening, then the occasional ice cream or the carrot or whatever, a peppermint, fine. But if their sugar content is high from the grain and the hay that you're feeding them, they will never get that flow of fat in there. The fat will become stagnant inside the muscle cell. It's called intracellular fat, and it will prevent the further intake of sugar. And so excess sugar is going to be over there. We'll store it as a safety feature. Remember, if glucose and sugar was good for you, we would store it as sugar, right? We wouldn't store it as fat. But we don't. We store it as fat because fat is safe. Sugar is toxic to our organs, to our blood vessels, and it's the high sugar content of food that's led to the devastation of human health. Obesity, diabetes, atherosclerosis, and a litany of other diseases. And because I've been with horses so long, I'm seeing the same thing happen there. We're seeing it in our dogs. We're seeing it in all animals that are kept in our care. And we have to just put the brakes on the one thing, and that is excess sugar. Remember, sugar is not required. You do not have to eat it. But you say, well, what happens when the fruit comes ripe? And there's oranges, and there's apples, and there's, figs, and all these other things that have sugar in it. Well, know that that's a seasonal food for most of us. And that will help us add body fat. So when winter is amongst us and there is no more fruit, it's all dead. We'll have some body fat to use, and we'll start to bring that body fat in when the glucose drops down, and it's the middle of December, January, February for most of us in the Northern Hemisphere, and we don't have access to fruits, now the fat can come in and we can lose our body fat and propel us through the winter, no problem. Now, you could also say, well, what about those people that live in the tropics where all they have is fruit and the fruit is there all year round? They have a completely different gut microbiome and genetics that alter this so they can use that. All right? There is a way. But on every mammal, and we're talking about your horses now, whether they're an Icelandic horse or a Paso down in the equator, they will take any excess sugar that you feed them and they will store it as body fat. Body fat and the excess nutrition or fuel that's in the muscle cells will prevent the muscle cell from working to its maximum efficiency. It will release a element, phosphorus, that will be used by inflammatory cells to increase inflammation, which will lead to dysfunction of the cell and dysfunction of the body. Illness and breakdown follow. But by decreasing the amount of sugar that goes in, you'll decrease the amount of inflammation. You'll get the cell working more efficiently. You won't be accumulating free radicals or pollution. And you'll get this steady stream of fat coming off the fat stores into the cell and moving out. Now, if you're using your horse to the point where they're using more fat off their body than they should, and they're getting too lean, so you're starting to see a skinny horse, there is a stage that you have to understand that if you decide to do this and your horse has been chronically protein deficient and has had excess calories in the form of sugar brought in, as that fat melts away, it's like someone taking their coat off and realizing that they have no muscular structure underneath. The muscles have gone because those muscles have been used for food that's been converted into glucose. Remember, all proteins are made up of amino acids. Those amino acids can be broken down by the liver through this Randle cycle into glucose and feed the brain to keep the animal alive. So when you start to lose body fat, you're going to see a horse that is really not an athlete. So you have to feed excess protein to build the muscle. You also have to understand that if your horse needs more calories, it's better to feed it in the form of pasture. If you don't have that, in hay. If you don't have that, in a fat source like shredded coconut and cool stance, and if you don't have that, then feed a whole grain where the outer shell has been removed. So the outer shell has those proteins that cause inflammation. So get cleaned oats and then put the oats in there and just enough so they start to add some body fat. It's a tricky business because every horse is different. On the flip side, if you have a horse that looks pretty lean and you go to no grain and you start adding all the protein and the horse starts becoming fat, the reason is the horse's microbiome is taking the protein and turning it into sugar. There's still a blockage going on where the horse feels like it needs sugar, and it'll break the soybean meal down into glucose for utilization, which will trigger insulin, which will prevent fat loss and will actually take any extra sugar and add it to fat. So it's possible to get fat on a high protein diet if your body is not working properly. And the fix to that, I'm not too sure what it is other than decrease all caloric intake until you get that fat flow, that river of fat from the fat cells down the stream of blood into the muscle cells, and it's utilized, burned up, and converted into carbon dioxide or water and excreted. That's the only way you're going to get rid of body fat. It's the only way. Diet and exercise. It's been proven 1 million times. Increase the amount of exercise, change the diet so there's no more sugar coming in, and you will achieve the fat loss that you're looking for. So I'm ending this podcast early because I want to break these down into more bite-sized chunks, and that's glucose. So to summarize, please remember that glucose is toxic when running loose in the body. To prevent the toxic effects, there are 3 things that happen, maybe 4. 1, glucose is stored as glycogen so it doesn't do damage in the cell. Excess glucose in the cell is burned as rapidly as possible and will take precedence over fat burning, which causes the ending of the flow of body fat from the fat cells into the cell for more efficient and better use of fuel. Third, glucose will be converted into body fat by the liver. So, and glucose will be, any free glucose running around the blood is going to be collected by insulin and escorted so it doesn't damage. So, insulin, storage as glycogen, burned in the cells, or turned into fat. That's it. It is so important to get rid of glucose that your body's created such good, efficient ways to get rid of it. Why stress your body, or the horse's body, by adding more glucose than it needs? You don't have to. Every animal on the planet can live without glucose being put in the mouth. When it is put in the mouth, it's turned into body fat for the winter, so they have the body fat in reserve so they can use that. But it's body fat that fuels the mammal, body fat that fuels the horse. Cellulose conversion by the gut microbiome will convert cellulose into fat. That's a high-fat diet. That's what horses live on. They live on fat, not sugar. Stop feeding sugar. It's that simple. And if you do, just write everything down, because over the next 2 weeks and the several months and years after you do that, if you look back in your journal, you're going to find that, wow, a lot of these problems went away, especially if you add back the protein. We'll get into that in another podcast. And if you've heard all this before, that's good. Now, take this information, try to put it in your head to a point where you can go and teach it to others. I'm just one guy. The more of you that are out there, the more of you who can get veterinarians to start thinking like this, instead of just testing for insulin or ACTH, let's dig in and solve this problem, stop it from happening, and start getting healthier horses. It's really that simple. It's the right thing to do. Okay, that's it, Doc T. I'm out of here. Thank you for taking your time with me. Please pass this on, and I'll see you later. Bye.
Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's 2 reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.